I remember the sound before I remember the moment. The steady tapping of rain against the old cedar siding of my house in rural Montana. There's something about that sound. It gets into your head. It's soft, almost soothing at first, until it isn't. Until it becomes a reminder of how empty a house can feel when you're the only one awake inside it. It was late, past midnight, and I was sitting by the big bay window in my living room. The one Laura always said made the place feel open and alive. She'd put lace curtains there once, but I'd taken them down years ago after she said they blocked the light. Now the glass was bare and I could see my reflection staring back at me in the dim glow of the fireplace. The man looking at me was tired. 54 with more gray in his hair than he liked to admit, lines etched deep into his face from years of work and maybe a few too many regrets. The rain had picked up, a steady rhythm against the window pane. Outside, the trees swayed like dark ghosts in the wind. It was one of those Montana nights when the world feels endless, where the stars hide, and all you can hear is the whisper of the wind through the valley. It made me feel small, like the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. My phone buzzed on the coffee table beside me, the sudden vibration startling in the quiet. I glanced at it, half expecting another late-night reminder from the weather app or a spam call. But the message preview froze me. You deserve to know the truth. Check your email. At first, I thought it was some scam. The internet's full of people trying to scare you into clicking links. I almost ignored it. But something about those words, you deserve to know the truth, and they stuck under my skin like a splinter. There was something personal in them. Something aimed. I stared at the message for a long while, feeling my heartbeat slow, then quicken again. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe I was just too alone for too long. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever sent that message knew me. So I opened my laptop. It was sitting on the table near the couch, still open from earlier that evening when I'd been trying to balance out next quarter's financial reports for the company. I remember my hands felt heavy as I typed in my email password. The screen blinked once and there it was. An unread message sitting right at the top. No subject line, no sender name, just an address full of random letters and numbers. I clicked it. No words, no explanation. Just one attachment. A video file named For You to MP4. I hesitated. Everything inside me said to close it. But my curiosity, my fear, and maybe a touch of guilt made me press play. The video opened in a small window. At first it was just static, shaky footage like someone filming from behind a corner. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. The image steadied and I realized it was a restaurant, dimly lit, quiet, the kind of place Laura loved when we still celebrated anniversaries. And then, I saw her, Laura, my wife of 30 years. Her hair was a little shorter than last time we went out, but I knew that laugh, that soft, breathy laugh that had once filled our kitchen on Sunday mornings. I'd fallen in love with that laugh before I ever kissed her. I used to think it was the sound of home, but that night she wasn't laughing with me. She was sitting across from a man, leaning in close, eyes shining in the candlelight. It took me a second to realize who he was. Daniel Pierce, my business partner, my friend of over 20 years. And then, like a punch I didn't see coming, I noticed someone else at that table. My son, Ethan. He was smiling, laughing with them, relaxed, comfortable, as if this scene wasn't strange or wrong, as if it was normal. My first thought, the one I wanted to believe, was that this was a business dinner. Maybe Daniel was mentoring Ethan. Maybe Laura just happened to join them. I told myself stories, excuses, anything to make the twisting feeling in my gut go away. But then I saw it. Laura reached across the table, and her hand slid into Daniel's. Not by accident. Not a casual brush. A deliberate, intimate gesture. The kind you don't share with someone unless there's something deeper. Daniel smiled at her. That easy grin I'd seen 1,000 times when he closed a deal or told a joke at the office Christmas party. Ethan didn't even flinch. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look hurt. He looked like he already knew. That's when the air left my lungs. I froze, staring at that image on the screen, trying to make sense of it, trying to tell myself there had to be some other explanation. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the video was doctored. Maybe... No. I'd know that look anywhere. The way Laura's fingers lingered. The way Daniel looked at her like she belonged to him. That wasn't new. That wasn't a mistake caught in a moment. That was familiarity. I paused the video and leaned back in my chair. The house around me was so quiet that I could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint ticking of the old wall clock Laura's mother gave us when we first moved in. Every sound felt sharper, heavier. The man staring back at me from the reflection on the screen didn't look like me. His eyes were darker, hollow. His shoulders slumped under a weight that hadn't been there an hour ago. I didn't know what to do. I didn't even know what I was feeling. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was disbelief, a hollow ache sitting somewhere behind my ribs. I watched the rest of the video, all 10 minutes of it. The conversation was muffled, but I caught bits and pieces. Laughter. A toast. Laura's voice, soft and familiar, saying something about a new beginning. A new beginning. I shut the laptop, but the image didn't leave me. It stayed there, burned into the back of my eyelids every time I blinked. The rain outside turned into a downpour, the wind howling against the walls as if the whole valley was trying to drown out what I'd just seen. But no storm could wash away that moment. I remember standing up, pacing the living room, hands trembling without reason. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't even feel the beat anymore, just a steady throb of shock running through me. The coffee I'd been drinking hours ago was still on the table, cold and untouched. I took a sip without thinking, just to do something, and nearly gagged from the bitterness. I walked to the window and stared out into the dark, the rain streaking down the glass like tears I refused to shed. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out. The sound echoed off the hills, lonely and sharp. I thought of Ethan, of the nights I stayed up helping him study, the mornings I drove him to baseball practice before work. I thought of Laura, the way she used to wait up for me when I came home late from job sites just to make sure I ate. And now, this the woman I loved and the son I'd raised, both sitting across from the man I trusted more than anyone outside my family. That night stretched on forever. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. I just sat there staring into the dark, listening to the rain, feeling like the house around me had turned into a stranger's home. I didn't know it then, but that email, that video, it was just the start. The first crack in the glass. The thread that would unravel everything I thought was true. Everything I was. And as the night bled into morning, one thought kept circling in my head. Quiet, persistent, terrifying in its simplicity. If they could do this once, how long had they been doing it? I used to think I was a good man. Not perfect, God knows I've made my share of mistakes, but solid. The kind of man you could count on. The kind of man people trusted to show up when he said he would, to finish what he started, to keep his word even when it cost him something. All my life, I believed that being steady was enough. That if you worked hard, treated people right, and put your family first, the universe would find a way to reward you for it. Maybe not with riches or fame, but with peace. The quiet kind of peace that comes from knowing you've done right by the people you love. For nearly 40 years, I worked in construction. Started out hauling lumber and laying concrete before I even had a proper license. Back then, it wasn't about ambition or profit. It was about survival. I wanted to build something that would last longer than me. Something I could pass on to my boy one day. I built Hale and Pierce Construction from the ground up, literally. We started with a rusty pickup truck, one second-hand drill, and a dream. There were months when Laura and I ate beans 3 nights a week just to keep the lights on. But somehow we made it through. Daniel Pierce came into my life around that time. He was 10 years younger than me, ambitious as hell and smoother than a salesman at a Sunday fair. He had that kind of charm that could make clients open their wallets before he'd even shown them a blueprint. And me? I was the builder, the muscle, the guy in the mud making things stand upright. It worked. I handled the foundation. He handled the face. I never minded it. I wasn't made for fancy words or handshakes. My satisfaction came from the smell of fresh sawdust, the crack of the hammer, the satisfaction of a job done right. And Laura, she was the heart that kept me going. Laura was the kind of woman who made every place feel like home. I still remember the first time I saw her. She was standing in line at the diner off Main Street, wearing a red scarf and holding a stack of library books. She smiled at the waitress like they'd known each other for years, though I'd never seen her there before. She had this way about her, gentle but sure, like she belonged wherever she went, She was a teacher back then, elementary school, the kind that kids remember their whole lives because she made them feel seen. She'd come home after long days, hair messy from the wind, and still find the strength to listen to my stories about stubborn clients or the roof that wouldn't hold. She used to pack my lunches in old brown paper bags, writing little notes on them like, "You're building our dreams, one nail at a time." I used to laugh and tuck those notes into my wallet. I found one years later, after we'd been married 25 years. It was faded, but the words were still there, written in her soft, looping handwriting. That's the woman I fell in love with, the one who believed in me before I even believed in myself. Ethan came along a few years later. Our only child. I remember holding him in the hospital room, his tiny fingers curling around mine and feeling this surge of purpose. That's what I worked for, him. Everything I built, every risk I took, every late night, it was all for that little boy. I wanted to be the kind of father he'd be proud of. Not the loud kind, not the showy kind, but the steady kind, the kind of man who led by example. And for a long time, I thought I was doing it right. The company grew fast in the late 90s. We went from small residential jobs to big commercial contracts, schools, hospitals, apartment complexes. The name Hale and Pierce started showing up on billboards and trucks across the county. It felt good, like the world was finally paying attention. Daniel was brilliant at the business side. He could talk anyone into a deal. Clients adored him. I trusted him with everything, the finances, the paperwork, the future, and maybe that was my first mistake. You see, when you trust someone for too long without checking in, you start to confuse comfort with loyalty. You stop looking for cracks because you don't want to see them. Laura used to say I worked too much. She wasn't wrong. I'd come home late most nights, too tired to talk, too distracted to notice the small changes. The way she stopped leaving notes in my lunchbox. The way her hugs became shorter, more polite. Ethan grew up fast, too. By the time he hit high school, he was more interested in business suits than baseball bats. He wanted to be like Daniel, sharp, confident, respected. I used to take him to construction sites on weekends, try to show him the satisfaction of hard work, but he'd just nod and ask questions about profits and expansion. I told myself it was fine. Kids grow, times change. But now, looking back, I see it clear as day. They didn't drift away all at once. It was little things. Missed dinners. Quiet arguments. The way Laura started dressing up more on days she said she was just meeting friends. The way Ethan stopped calling me Dad and started calling me Richard around Daniel, like he was trying to impress him. At the time, I chalked it up to growing pains, to them wanting their own space, their own world. I never thought it meant I was losing them. I was so focused on building a future for my family that I didn't notice I was building it alone. There's something cruel about hindsight. It shows you all the warnings you ignored. The way Laura's laughter faded when I entered a room. The way Daniel started making decisions without running them by me. The way Ethan seemed more proud of Daniel's approval than mine, but I kept telling myself it was fine. That's what good men do, right? They push through. They trust. They forgive the small things because family and friendship are supposed to be unbreakable. I thought loyalty was a shield. Turns out, it was a blindfold, because sometimes the wolves aren't clawing at the door, sometimes they're sitting at your dinner table, smiling, toasting to your success, calling you partner and dad. It didn't happen overnight. Betrayal rarely does. It starts small. A secret here, a half-truth there. The air shifts, but you ignore it because it's easier to believe everything's fine. Until one day you wake up and realize the home you built with your own hands isn't yours anymore. You stand in the middle of your living room, your pictures on the wall, your coffee mug on the table, and yet somehow, you're a stranger there. That's where I was long before that night I got the email. I just didn't know it yet. I used to think being a good man was enough to protect the life I built. But what I learned, painfully, slowly, is that being good doesn't make you safe. Because goodness doesn't guard against betrayal. It just gives you farther to fall when it comes. And by the time you realize you've hit the ground, it's too late. The people you loved most are standing over you, dusting off their hands like they've done nothing wrong. That's who I was. The man who believed love and loyalty could keep the wolves away. But what I didn't see, what I couldn't see, was that the wolves had already made themselves at home. That video, it became the ghost that lived inside my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. That dim restaurant light, the clinking of glasses, the soft murmur of laughter that wasn't meant for me. It looped in my mind like a curse. I'd rewind it, pause it, squint at the blurred edges of the frame like maybe, just maybe, I'd find some mistake. Some trick of the light that made me misread everything. But no matter how I twisted it, no matter how many times I hit replay, the truth stayed the same. Laura's fingers brushed Daniel's hand. Tender, familiar, not an accident. Ethan's smile wasn't confusion or surprise. It was comfort, acceptance, and that realization. It cracked something deep inside me. The first few hours after watching it, I didn't move. I sat there staring at the paused screen, my family frozen in betrayal, while the coffee on my table went stone cold. I remember the way the house sounded in that silence. The clock ticking. The refrigerator humming. The wind pressing against the windows. Ordinary sounds, but they felt louder that night, like the world was mocking me with its calm. When dawn finally came, it felt wrong. The sunlight poured in through the blinds, painting stripes across the floorboards, and for a second I almost convinced myself it was all just a bad dream. But then I looked down at my laptop. That email was still open. That video was still paused, and the reality hit all over again. That's when something changed in me. I wasn't just hurt anymore, I was curious. And curiosity, when mixed with pain, becomes something dangerous. I didn't confront Laura, I didn't call Ethan, I didn't march into Daniel's office demanding answers. No, I played it slow. I'd learned long ago that you don't walk into a fight without knowing who's really holding the knife. So I started digging, quietly. First, I checked Laura's phone bill. Nothing obvious, but there were patterns. Late-night text to a number saved under school board. I'd never thought twice about it before. But now it made sense. Daniel had served on that board years ago. Then came the bank statements. Small transfers, coffee shops, hotel lounges, dinners in the city on weekends, when Laura told me she was visiting her sister in Helena. The receipts told a story she never had the courage to say out loud. And Ethan, God, I wanted to believe my son was innocent. I really did. But the more I looked, the more I saw it. He'd been working closer with Daniel lately, taking over accounts I used to manage myself. I thought it was mentorship, growth. Now I knew it was alliance. I remember driving to the office that week, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight they left marks. The roads felt longer, the air heavier. Even my employees noticed. "Everything okay, Mr. Hale?" They'd ask, I'd smile, tell them I was fine. But inside, I was falling apart in slow motion. At night, I'd sit on the porch, that video playing on my phone again. The sound of their laughter cut deeper each time. And the more I watched, the more questions piled up. How long had it been going on? When did my wife start lying to me? When did my son stop respecting me enough to tell me the truth? You'd think that kind of betrayal would turn a man bitter overnight. But it didn't, not yet. I was still in that stage where pain feels like confusion, where you're begging the universe for a mistake, for something that'll make sense of it all. One night, I took out an old photo album, the one Laura used to keep under the coffee table. I flipped through pictures of Ethan's graduation, of our family camping trips, of Christmas mornings where the three of us sat smiling under the tree. I kept waiting for some sign, some shadow of deceit in their eyes, but all I saw was love, or what looked like it. That's the cruel thing about betrayal. It doesn't rewrite your past, it stains it. Every memory becomes a lie you have to unlearn. By the end of that week, sleep wasn't an option anymore. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, hearing their voices echoing through my dreams. The video played in my head without my consent, again and again, until I started feeling like I was losing my grip on reality. That's when I decided, if this video found me, it could lead me somewhere. Someone sent it, someone who wanted me to see it, but who, and why now? I traced the email. The address was encrypted, masked through some disposable server, but one clue slipped through, a timestamp. The video had been uploaded from a location just a few miles from my company's headquarters. That night, I made a choice. I wasn't going to be a victim in my own life story. I'd spent my years building everything from the ground up. I could rebuild myself too. But first, I needed the full truth. I shut the laptop, took a long breath, and looked out the window. The mountains were still dark, the valley quiet. Somewhere out there, someone thought they could bury me in secrets, but I wasn't the kind of man who stayed buried. This wasn't just about a broken marriage anymore. This was about discovering how deep betrayal could go and how far I'd go to expose it, and that's when the real story began. It's strange how silence can become your closest ally when you start hunting for truth. Every morning, I'd wake up before dawn, long before Laura stirred, and sit at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, my laptop open, the glow of the screen painting ghosts across my face. The house was still, except for the creak of old wood and the distant hum of wind outside the windows. It was in those quiet hours that I began my investigation, not out of anger, not yet, but out of a desperate need to understand. They say every lie leaves a trail. Receipts, patterns, little inconsistencies that seem harmless until you start connecting the dots. And once you start seeing those dots, you can't unsee them. I began with the basics and the digital breadcrumbs. Laura's phone logs showed late-night calls to Daniel's number, labeled under school board. Cute, clever even. But not clever enough. I cross-checked her calendar, her travel routes, and her credit card. Transactions, every conference or educational meeting she claimed to attend had a matching hotel, booking in Helena or Missoula. The same weekends Daniel's expense reports showed. Client dinners and out-of-town meetings. Didn't need a private investigator. I had time, patience, and the rage of a man who'd been made a fool of. Then came Ethan, my son. He'd always been ambitious, eager to make a mark. I used to admire that. I thought I'd raised him to be sharp, determined. But somewhere along the way, ambition curdled into greed. I saw it in the way he carried himself lately, confident, almost smug, like he knew something I didn't. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe betrayal makes you paranoid. But then I found an email chain that changed everything. I was in the office one evening after everyone had left. I had stayed behind under the excuse of finalizing payroll reports. Truth was, I'd been combing through our company servers for weeks, quietly checking Daniel's correspondence. He wasn't sloppy, but he wasn't as careful as he thought either. Buried deep inside a shared folder labeled Archives 2018, I found it. A set of encrypted drafts. It took me hours to decode them. But when I finally opened the document, my heart nearly stopped. It was a draft contract, a merger agreement. Daniel Pierce and an investor group out of Denver, men I'd met once at a conference years ago. The plan was to sell Hale and Pierce Construction within 6 months, quietly, in exchange for a massive payout. The only missing signature on that contract was mine. And at the bottom of the draft, right beneath Daniel's name, was Ethan's, listed as successor CEO. I remember sitting there for what felt like hours, staring at that line, my fingers trembling against the desk. The office was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the ceiling lights. Everything I'd worked for, 4 decades of sweat-busted knuckles, sleepless nights, and was being packaged and sold like a used car, all while I sat across the dinner table smiling at the people planning my downfall. That moment broke something inside me, not in the way heartbreak does, but in the way an old foundation finally gives under too much weight. But I didn't explode. No. I got quieter. Still. Focused. I started taking notes. A hidden journal in my phone disguised as a shopping list app. Every odd call, every meeting Laura went to, every slip of information I overheard. I recorded it all. If they were building a case against me, I'd build one right back. I even started recording our conversations. Tiny voice memos from my pocket when Daniel would come by the office and talk about long-term growth or company stability. His words were sugar-coated lies, promises he'd already sold out. At home, things grew tense. Laura noticed I wasn't sleeping well. She'd reach for my hand in bed and ask if something was wrong. I'd smile, lie through my teeth. Just work stress, honey. She'd kiss my shoulder and whisper, "You've been through worse." And that's what cut deepest. She said it so naturally, as if the comfort she offered wasn't laced with betrayal. One night, I followed her. She said she was driving to Helena for a 2-day seminar. I waited an hour, then got in my truck and took the back roads. The night was heavy with rain. the kind that blurs headlights into streaks of white. I stayed far enough behind that she wouldn't notice me. When she finally pulled into a hotel parking lot, I parked half a block away. I watched her step out of the car, adjust her coat, and walk into the lobby. A few minutes later, Daniel's car rolled in. He didn't even hesitate, went straight inside. I sat there in my truck, the engine idling, my knuckles white around the steering wheel. I could have walked in right then, made a scene, exposed them both, but something inside me stopped me. I wasn't ready for confrontation. Not yet. Because by then I understood something. This wasn't just an affair, it was a coup. They weren't trying to destroy my heart. They were trying to erase my legacy. I drove back home that night, the rain washing the dust off my windshield and yet somehow making the world feel filthier. When I got back, I poured myself a glass of whiskey, sat at the kitchen counter, and opened my laptop again. I began copying everything, contracts, emails, messages, and onto a private hard drive. If they thought they could corner me, they didn't know who they were dealing with. For years, I taught Ethan that a man's word was his bond, that you never turned your back on the people who helped you build your dream. Now I realized, maybe he'd learned a different lesson. Maybe he'd learned that power comes from knowing when to betray first, but I wasn't done, not by a long shot. The next morning, as Laura packed her bags for another school retreat, I kissed her goodbye and smiled like everything was fine. She smiled back, easy, unbothered, the way only a liar can. And in that quiet moment, as the door shut behind her, I whispered to myself, this time, I'll be the one writing the ending, because I finally knew what their next phase meant, and I was about to make sure it never saw the light of day. There are moments in life that split everything into before and after. For me, that night was one of them. I didn't plan to confront her, and hell, I'd rehearsed a dozen versions of that conversation in my head. But when it finally happened, it came out raw, unpolished. Straight from the gut. It was late, close to midnight. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that hums in your ears when everyone else is asleep. I came home earlier than usual, but I didn't make a sound. Laura was in the kitchen, barefoot, pouring herself a glass of red wine. The faint light above the stove painted her in soft gold, and for a brief second, she looked like the woman I fell in love with. Calm, beautiful, familiar. But then the weight of everything hit me again. The emails, the contract, the lies, and something inside me just snapped. I stepped forward. My voice came out rougher than I expected. How long? She froze. The bottle stopped midair. Not a word, not even a flinch of confusion, just silence. And in that silence, I had my answer. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I just stood there watching her eyes fill with tears. She looked down, then back at me, her voice trembling. Richard, I never wanted to hurt you. It wasn't supposed to happen. It just happened, she said. Like betrayal was something you trip into by accident. That line. God, I'd heard it in movies, in books, in other people's tragedies. But hearing it from her in our kitchen with our memories hanging on the walls around us, that's when it became real. I wanted to ask why. I wanted to scream. But what came out instead was quieter, colder. And Ethan? Did it just happen for him too? That's when her expression changed. It wasn't shock. It wasn't guilt, it was fear. She stepped closer, voice barely above a whisper. Richard, please. Don't call him tonight. He doesn't know you know, but she was wrong. He knew exactly what he was doing. I could feel it in my bones. I walked past her, straight to the living room, grabbed my phone, and dialed Ethan's number. My hands were shaking, but my voice, and it came out steady, calm, almost too calm. He picked up after the second ring. Hey, Dad, he said, casual, like nothing was wrong. I didn't waste time. How long have you been working with Daniel? There was a pause. The kind of pause where 1,000 lies scramble for a place to hide. Then, in that cool, practiced tone I barely recognized, he said, Dad, it's just business. You wouldn't understand. Just business. 2 words that carved through me like a blade. 30 years of sacrifice. The nights I missed sleep so I could pay for his tuition. The weekends I spent fixing the company books while he played baseball. The years I broke my back to give him a future, all reduced to business. I don't remember hanging up. I just remember the sound of the phone hitting the counter and Laura's voice behind me. begging me to calm down, saying things like he's confused and you don't know the whole story. But I did. I knew enough. I turned to her and said quietly, "You should go stay at your sister's for a few days." Her tears came harder then, but I didn't move. I didn't reach for her like I used to, because in that moment, I wasn't her husband anymore. I was a stranger in the ruins of my own life. After she left, I sat there for hours staring at the empty wine glass she'd left on the counter. The house felt too big, too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. I thought about every promise we ever made, every dream we ever shared. I thought about the nights we stayed up laughing over cheap wine and broken furniture, dreaming of a future we'd already built. And then I thought about how easily they'd traded it, how cheap my loyalty must have looked to them. That's when something inside me hardened. I wasn't crying anymore. I wasn't shaking. I was just done. You know that moment when grief turns into clarity? When you stop asking why and start asking how? That's where I was. They had taken my trust, my marriage, my company. But I still had one thing left: control over how this story ended. I stood up, poured the rest of her wine down the drain, and made a silent promise to myself. I would not scream. I would not break. I would not become the fool they expected. I'd build my revenge with the same precision I once built houses, one piece at a time, measured, deliberate, unshakable. That night, as I stood at the window watching the storm roll over the valley, lightning cracked across the dark sky, illuminating the mountains for just a second. And in that flash I caught my own reflection, the man I used to be gone, the kind, forgiving husband, the proud father, the loyal friend. He was gone. In his place stood someone new, someone colder, quieter, sharper. And that's the night Richard Hale died, and the man who would make them all answer was born. Revenge doesn't roar like a crowd. It doesn't wear a red cape or stage dramatic confrontations on the front lawn. For me, it began as a quiet thing, a kind of surgical patience. I learned early in construction that the best structures are built on steady foundations. The same rule applies to plans that are meant to last. They're measured, reinforced, and carried out one deliberate step at a time. Anger felt good for a minute, but it wouldn't win anything. What would win was strategy, paperwork, and patience. So I practiced the art of being ordinary. I put on my suit, straightened my tie, smiled in the fluorescent office light, and shook Daniel's hand like nothing had happened. I walked through the sites, checked the blueprints, nodded at men who trusted me for their paychecks. I let them think I was broken, that I would take my dignity and go quietly into the night. They were wrong. They had misread my silence for surrender. The first move was to gather allies, not friends who would hold my hand, but people who knew how to pull the right levers. I went to Sam Crowley, a man with a silver pen behind his ear and eyes that had seen too many dirty deals to be surprised by anything. Sam had once gotten me out of a legal tangle years ago, when a jealous competitor tried to sink one of our bids with false claims. We'd owed each other favors since then, and I called him not because I trusted lawyers, but because I needed someone who understood how webs of money hide beneath layers of paper. I didn't tell Sam everything at first. You learn early on not to hand the whole map to anyone, not even to someone who owes you. I told him enough to get him interested. A video, some odd expenses, an email trail that led to a draft contract. He listened the way people listen when something is both juicy and precise. Then he smiled that terrible small smile of his and said, "Let's peel the onion." Sam set me up with a private investigator, a lean man named Cole who smoked too much and could find phone numbers in snowdrifts if he wanted to. Cole worked quietly like a ghost slipping through locked doors. He traced Daniel's financial footprints with a stubbornness that made my own heart feel steadier. What he brought back told a story I should have already known, but hadn't wanted to see. Numbers rearranged like magicians' tricks, payments funneled through shell companies, invoices for consulting that led to accounts in states we never did business in. Small transfers, unremarkable on their own, painted a pattern when you paid attention. The more Cole dug, the clearer it became that Daniel had been siphoning profits for months, maybe years, stitching together a financial cushion to support a quiet sale. There were company expense reports with entries for client entertainment that matched hotel receipts in the city, payments to vendors who didn't exist, and a payroll line that had quietly grown to include employees who weren't on site. I remember the day Cole walked into my office with a manila folder and sat it on my desk like a judge dropping a gavel. He didn't need to say much. He slid a printout across the blotter, names of shell entities, dates, routes of money that moved like smoke. I ran my finger along the lines connecting accounts, and each connection tightened the knot in my stomach. It wasn't just that Daniel was betraying me emotionally. He was stealing what I'd built, selling off the bones of the company while keeping the smile ready for board meetings. Sam began to quietly review our corporate records, comparing signatures, checking for authorizations, and digging through the ghostly corners of our accounting software. He found drafts of contracts in places no honest man would hide them. Hidden directories, mislabeled files, fragments of conversations saved under innocuous headings. He found emails where Daniel used code words for closing, and where Ethan's name appeared in a context that left little room for innocence. My son had not just been charmed by promises, he'd been groomed into a role. Ethan wasn't a pawn without agency. He was a willing participant who saw a quick ladder to the top. I slept less in those weeks than I had in years. When I did close my eyes, I saw balance sheets instead of dreams. But there was something temple-like about the work. Each piece of evidence I collected was a stone I could place on the side of truth. I photographed receipts, copied ledgers onto an encrypted hard drive, and recorded conversations that felt like confessions. I used things I had: access to the office server, the instinct to look where a crook thinks no one will, and a lifetime of learning how to read human patterns. I became vigilant in ways that felt clinical. I was careful to leave no trace of my own movements. The last thing I needed was for them to smell fear and shut the deal faster. We learned that Daniel had been working with a group of investors out of Denver. They were men with polished shoes and patient smiles, the kind who buy families' legacies with a glossy veneer and a handshake. They'd been in contact for months about a buyout, and the plan seemed to have everything staged: legalese drafted, a timeline, and the promise of a clean sale. What they didn't know was that the signatures they had planned on collecting could be questioned, that the money trail had detours, and that their opportunity came wrapped in someone else's theft. Sam and I crafted a different kind of instrument. Not a court summons, not a fistfight, but a targeted disclosure. I picked up the phone and called the lead investor, an old contact of mine who'd once admired our work. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg. I told them exactly who I was, the founder, the man whose name was on the company's door. I told them about the video, the draft contract, the shell entities. I told them in a dry, factual way what would happen if they went ahead. Criminal inquiries, public exposure, a mess that would cost them more than any tidy buyout promised. I expected disbelief. I expected denials. Instead, I heard silence and then a voice that began asking questions. My approach was not to threaten, but to make business sense. Investors don't like risk. They don't like headlines. So I framed the truth as their risk exposure, the numbers, the proof, the implication that buying into this deal could make them partners in a scandal. I offered them a choice: walk away quietly or go forward and face the consequences. I had immunity from nothing, but I had something more useful in that moment: documentation, a methodical paper trail, and the ability to show them the exact places where the money had flowed. I remember the feeling when I ended that call. Not triumph, exactly, but relief, like someone finally closing a long-opened wound. I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I went back to the office the next morning and sat at my desk, waiting. I watched Daniel as he came in, acting the part of the confident partner, unaware the floor had been pulled out from under him. He was sharp in a way that felt practiced, joking with the crew, telling everyone everything would be fine. He didn't know Sam had quietly sent a summary of our findings to the investor group that very night, attaching a few choice pieces of evidence that would make anyone with a ledger-sized conscience think twice. By mid-morning, the phone started ringing. First, the investor group's legal counsel called, then the lead man himself. Conversations happened behind closed doors. There were excuses, muffled voices, the kind of language that pretends to unwind a knot but actually tightens it. I could feel the shift. Board members who'd been on Daniel's side came to my office with guarded eyes, asking for clarity. They wanted to do what was best for the company, And suddenly that translated into asking hard questions of the man they had trusted with our books. When the call came through that afternoon, that the investors were pulling out, that the proposed deal was off the table, the room seemed to tilt. Daniel went white as a page. He tried to steady himself, to smile, to tell them there had been a misunderstanding, that all of this could be addressed. But the investor men had already seen the diagram of accounts and the ghost names, and their patience for drama was gone. They had walked away because the risk was no longer a tolerable one. It wasn't fireworks. There were no dramatic arrests or handcuffed scenes on the office lawn. The sale was dead by morning because I had made it unbearable to proceed. The smart players, and the ones who count money and headlines, folded like a hand with no good cards. For the first time since that night with the video, I felt something like control again. The plan had worked. But it wasn't a victory that filled me with joy. It was practical. It was necessary. It protected what I had left. It bought time. And if there's one thing betrayal doesn't do, it underestimates the patience of the man it tried to fool. When the first blow came, it came like a storm wind through an open window. Sudden, loud, impossible to ignore. Daniel didn't walk into my office that morning. He barreled in, all teeth and nerves, like a man who'd been cornered in a bad dream and decided to wake the world up with his rage. He slammed the door behind him, and the sound ricocheted off the concrete and glass like a gunshot. For a second, everyone in the room looked up, startled. Then they went back to their work, because that's what people do when trouble walks through the door. They pretend it's not theirs. He was red in the face, a knuckle whitening about his coffee cup. "You think you can stop this?" He spat like the words were physical things. "You're finished, Richard. Everyone knows it. You can't do a damn thing." I watched him, really watched him. The way men watch storms, knowing they can't control them but needing to understand their path. His suit, usually sharp and practiced, looked like it had been slept in. His tie was loose. His eyes didn't have any of that easy charm that had once disarmed clients. There was no charm left. Only panic, and beneath that, the kind of anger that comes from being caught. I didn't raise my voice. I don't think I even breathed loudly. I slid a manila folder across the desk toward him the way a dealer slides a playing card across a table, neutral, measured. The folder was thick. Inside were copies of bank transfers, invoices with false vendor names, screenshots of email threads where Daniel muttered about moving funds, and the draft contract with Ethan's name typed neatly beneath Daniel's signature. It was everything we'd assembled with Sam and Cole, the map of his treachery. He looked at the folder as if it were a live thing, something that might bite. His face, which had been flushed with fury, drained the color of blood being sucked out. For a second, he looked like a man about to faint. I didn't gloat. Because what's the point of rubbing a wound in when the person you love is already dying inside? I simply watched. He tried to talk. His mouth moved, hands gesticulating like an auctioneer. He tried to spin a story about accounting errors, about misplaced transactions and clerical mistakes. He said a dozen things that would have swayed a jury used to the theater of denial, but the words slid off me. I'd heard better lies from men trying to sell used cars. His defenses were thin, and every new sentence he offered made the folder on my desk look truer. "You taught me what loyalty costs." "Daniel," I said, my voice quieter than his but harder, the kind of voice that doesn't require volume to be heard. "Now it's time you pay the price." He stared at me like those words had landed like a stone in a pond, and maybe they had. He had always been good at making others pay, at spinning deals where he came out clean and the rest of us did the heavy lifting. But he'd miscounted. He'd thought the house he was quietly burning would collapse quietly too. He forgot that foundations can be checked, that signatures can be traced, that greed leaves fingerprints. In the days that followed, everything moved in slow motion and in sudden jerks. The board meetings, which usually felt like bad theater with men in gray suits trading polite threats, became something else entirely. Fingers were pointed behind closed doors. Men who had laughed with Daniel at dinners now avoided his eye like he was contagious. He tried calls, pleaded with partners for more time, sent emails filled with empty reassurances. But the investor group, who'd been courted with promises of profit, had already pulled out when they realized the deal would bring risk they couldn't afford. Board members came to me with questions more than accusations. That was the strangest part. Their faces were not triumphant. They were relieved. It was like a neighborhood watch discovering a thief in the community and feeling grateful someone else had finally called the cops. They wanted one thing more than revenge: stability. They wanted the company to survive without scandal and without burning to the ground, and for that they needed someone to steady the wheel. Within a week, the board had voted Daniel out. It wasn't pretty. He tried to make a scene at the meeting, to rattle the papers and call on allegiances. But this was no longer a playground for charm. This was legal territory. Lawyers circled like vultures, not for the spectacle, but for the ledger. The partners filed suits for embezzlement. The local press, in which always sniffed around for any hint of scandal, smelled blood and tried to prowl. But by then, Sam had already sanitized what needed to be handled publicly. And the legal action moved with a surgical, quiet efficiency that hurt worse than any screaming headline. And Laura, she left town. There was no goodbye, no messy shouting match in the driveway, no suitcase theatrics that play so well in movies. She packed light and drove off early one morning before the world had fully woken. I found her toothbrush missing from the cup by the sink and a note that said simply, "I'm sorry, that's it." Just those 2 words. No explanation, no plea. Silence is a language with many dialects. Hers spoke in absences. Ethan stayed away too. For a while I hoped he would come, to face us, to explain, to make up for whatever blind, stupid thing had led him there. But shame and pride are a strange mix. Shame makes you small, pride tells you to run. He chose to disappear into the background. I saw him once in a blurred reflection driving past the office. A figure hunched in the driver's seat, head down, hands white at the wheel. He didn't come in. He didn't look up. People who knew me started whispering in places I used to have lunch. Some offered sympathy. Some looked at me with an odd mixture of pity and calculation, like they were charting whether I'd be down for long enough to be taken advantage of. Friends called, some genuine, some with agendas. Clients checked on the company's stability, nervously asking questions about management and future plans. The industry talks, and always full of polite nods and measured tones, turned into a chorus of inquiries and quiet suggestions. It's funny how quickly everyone decides what's best for you when you're in a crisis. They all meant well, or at least the ones who stayed did. But there's a loneliness to being the center of a public fall that's heavier than private grief. Daniel's public unraveling was both procedural and surreal. His name was removed from the roster, his office cleaned out by people who didn't know him well enough to hate him, only to smooth the edges of his absence. Legal notices went out. Asset freezes were placed. The partners filed suit not with the melodrama of a revenge film, but with the slow insistence of machines doing their jobs. He scrambled, lawyered up, threatened countersuits. We expected that. We expected the dance of delay. But we had proof. Everything neatly lined up like bricks. And momentum favors the prepared. I didn't celebrate his defeat. There was no pleasure in watching a man I once called my brother being cut out of life by the very world he'd tried to manipulate. The anger that had fueled my investigation had softened into a brittle numbness. You don't ruin a man's life without a measure of sorrow, even if he deserved it. I felt oddly like a mason hammering a final wedge into a rotten beam. Necessary work, done with a steady hand. But the job itself left the place quieter and emptier. The hardest days were the ones after the action. The company stabilized. Contracts were reviewed, clients reassured, payrolls made. I took calls, sat in meetings, and kept the business running because that's what you do when the world looks to you. You keep the lights on. But at night the house was colder than before. Pictures on the mantel where faces had once glowed with shared jokes looked like photographs of strangers. The kitchen no longer smelled like her cooking. Breakfast was a lonely thing. The bed felt too big. I found myself moving through rituals of a life I'd once loved and treating them like museum pieces. Rare, well-preserved, and unreachable. There was a strange, almost surreal sense of liberation in the aftermath, too. To have the charade exposed meant the pain was real, but it also meant the deceit had been uprooted. The company wasn't sold. The money trail was interrupted. The men who might have bought into our name had backed out. I had fought to keep the thing I'd built intact, and for that I felt a stubborn pride. Yet even that pride carried a cost I hadn't foreseen, the price of knowledge. I now understood the limits of trust. I knew how quickly the world could undercut a man. That knowledge sat heavy with me, a weight that didn't go away. In the quiet that followed Daniel's fall, The truth lay open like a cut that needed time to heal. People remember the headlines, the dramatic arcs of a downfall, but they rarely dwell on the emptiness that lingers after the noise. Family members who'd once been close drifted away or made awkward attempts at contact. My name was safe on the building, but that didn't change what had been taken from the private corners of my life. If there was an unexpected mercy in all that collapse, it was that it forced me to see who remained. A few people stood by me without a second thought. Sam, who had been steady and relentless. Cole, the PI who didn't ask for glory. A few old clients who'd been with us since the truck days and recognized the blood in the bones of what we'd built. Their loyalty wasn't flashy. It was quiet, like a hearth fire that keeps a house warm in winter. They were the ones who helped me get back to the business of rebuilding. The fall had cost a lot. It had broken relationships in ways that might never fully mend. But the false edifice of Daniel's friendship and Ethan's ambition had crumbled, and what was left was real. Raw, painful, but honest. In that honesty, there was a chance to start again, to decide what mattered when the music stopped. So the company survived. Daniel's name was gone from our trucks, from contracts, from the Rolodexes of clients. The partners pressed charges. The lawsuits began. Laura's absence echoed in my home. Ethan's silence was a constant hum, and in the hollow places of my life I began to build something new. Not exactly a home yet, but the framework of a version of myself that could stand without the comforts I had once taken for granted. It's strange how quiet revenge feels once it's done. You imagine it'll roar, that once you've set everything right, the world will somehow cheer for you. You expect thunder, some kind of cosmic applause for enduring all that pain, for outsmarting those who wronged you. But what you get instead is silence. A deep, hollow kind of silence that echoes in places you didn't know could echo. In your chest, in your kitchen, in the space between who you were and who you've become. After Daniel's downfall and the lawsuits, after Laura's departure and Ethan's disappearance, I came home to a house that no longer felt like mine. Everything in it was familiar, but nothing belonged to me anymore. The smell of her perfume still lingered in the hallways, faint but stubborn, as if the walls themselves were refusing to let go of her. Her coffee mug still sat in the sink, lipstick faded on the rim, and I couldn't bring myself to wash it. The bed was still made on her side, the indentation of her pillow still visible, a small hollow where her head once rested. I remember standing in the living room one evening after work, the sun setting low and gold through the bay window. The light hit our wedding photo on the mantel, the one where she was laughing, head tilted back, hand in mine. It was taken 27 years ago in the summer, when everything still felt possible. The photo frame caught the light and shimmered like it was alive, and for a second, it almost felt like she was still there. But then the wind shifted through the chimney and that shimmer turned into a glare that stabbed my eyes, forcing me to look away. I realized I couldn't stay there anymore. You see, the strange thing about betrayal isn't just the act itself. It's what it does to space. Every room that once held warmth starts to feel cold. Every piece of furniture becomes evidence. The kitchen table where we had breakfast every Sunday now felt like a courtroom, a place where ghosts cross-examined me with silence. The sofa where Ethan and I used to watch football now looked like a grave marker for moments I couldn't bring back. The entire house had become a museum of a life that no longer existed, and I was the last visitor left wandering through its exhibits. So I sold it. Not in anger, not in haste, but in surrender. Some endings don't need fireworks. They just need closure. It took weeks to pack everything. I went through each drawer slowly, touching things like they were fragile bones from a life long buried. Her letters, her old school papers, a few of Ethan's childhood drawings. I couldn't throw them away, but I couldn't keep them either. So I boxed them up and took them to a storage unit outside town, locked it, and left the key on top of the box. I never went back for it. When the house finally emptied, I stood at the door one last time. The realtor had already taken pictures. The for sale sign had been hammered into the front yard, and the walls echoed every step I took. I tried to imagine another family living there, laughter spilling from the same kitchen, footsteps on the same staircase, and for a moment, that thought comforted me. Maybe the house could still hold love, even if I couldn't. After the sale, I bought a small cabin near Flathead Lake. Nothing fancy, just wood and quiet. The kind of place where you can hear the wind move through the trees and the water lap against the shore. I didn't want neighbors. I didn't want noise. I just wanted stillness, the kind of stillness that doesn't ask for explanations. The first few nights there were hard. The silence was too big. I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and listen to the lake breathe. Out here you can actually hear the difference between silence and peace. Silence is heavy and it presses on you. Peace just lets you breathe. But it took time to tell them apart. Inside, the cabin was bare, and a bed, a chair, a desk. I didn't decorate. No pictures, no reminders, just one small lamp that hummed faintly when turned on. Sometimes I'd sit there for hours staring at nothing, tracing the lines in the wooden floorboards. I thought about Laura, about Daniel, about Ethan. I thought about the version of myself that used to believe love was unbreakable. People say time heals, but I don't believe that. Time doesn't heal. Time just gives you distance, space to understand, to sit with your pain until it becomes something you can carry without shaking. Healing isn't forgetting. It's learning how to live with the echo. I still have moments where I wake up expecting to hear her in the kitchen, humming to herself, or Ethan's car pulling up in the driveway. But then I remember those sounds belong to another life. What's left now is this quiet cabin, this lake, and the rhythm of rain on the roof. And maybe that's enough. Sometimes when the moon is full and the lake reflects it like a mirror, I catch myself talking out loud. Not praying, not pleading, just talking. To her, to him, to the man I used to be. The words vanish into the night, carried off by the wind across the water. And though no one answers, there's comfort in the act itself. Like I'm reminding the world that I'm still here. I've come to realize that revenge doesn't restore what you've lost. It doesn't patch the holes in your heart. It just returns balance, takes something from those who took from you. But after that balance is restored, you're left with emptiness, the kind that makes you question what to do next. Because once the storm is over and the enemies are gone and the noise quiets, you're left alone with the ruins with nothing but the sound of your own breath. This cabin became my refuge and my prison. Every creak of the wood feels like the house breathing around me. Every gust of wind against the window feels like a whisper from the past. But it's honest here. The silence doesn't lie. The lake doesn't pretend. And that's something I can live with. I've learned that not every story ends with triumph. Some just end with truth. And truth, as I've discovered, is quieter than anyone tells you. It doesn't arrive with music or redemption. It just sits beside you like an old friend and waits for you to accept it. So here I am in this small cabin by Flathead Lake, telling you my story, not because I want pity or revenge or redemption, but because sometimes speaking the truth out loud is the only way to make peace with it. Maybe that's what time really gives you, the courage to tell your story without trembling. And that's where I am now. Alone, yes, but not broken. Just a man learning how to live with the quiet after the storm. Months had a way of folding in on themselves after the dust settled. Days blurred into other days until I stopped counting. The cabin, the lake, the work at the company. They kept me busy enough to distract the worst parts of my brain. I thought I was ready to leave the whole mess alone, to let the past be past. Then the phone rang. It was late afternoon. I was fixing a roof on a small job 2 towns over, gloves caked with tar, when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I fished it out thinking it might be Sam with another legal update or maybe one of the older clients checking on progress. The name on the screen stopped me cold. Ethan. For a long second I couldn't move. My hands went numb like the blood had left them. Everything I'd built up, the rage, the planning, the slow measured work of dismantling the scheme, narrowed down to one thin line of possibility. I wanted to slam the phone down. I wanted to let it ring and ring until the neighbor's dog started to howl and someone else took the call. My first instinct was to hang up and forget the number of the boy who'd become a man I hardly recognized. Then the voice came through, and it was different than I expected. He wasn't angry. He was breaking. "Dad," he said, and his voice was a broken thing. "I need to talk." "Can we meet?" He sounded like a boy who had been beaten by life, not physically but by the slow erosion of consequences. He told me, between sobs and pauses, that Daniel had fled the country the night before a deposition, that the legal pressure and the partners' suits had driven him to take the money and run. Everything he had hidden was collapsing. Ethan was left with debts he never expected to owe, with creditors knocking, and with a mother whose medical bills were mounting because, Laura was sick. Sick in a way that made hospitals and hospitals bills part of the vocabulary I'd tried to bury. Every part of me wanted to end the call right then. I felt like smashing the phone against the truck dash. But something else, maybe a reflex from all the years I'd taught him the difference between right and wrong, or maybe the last sliver of fatherhood that didn't burn out, made me agree. Okay, I said. We'll meet. Noon, the diner off Route 93, the one with the cracked neon sign. I've always believed in face-to-face things. Texts are for convenience, but truth reveals itself in how a man looks at you when he can't hide behind words. We agreed, hung up, and the world tilted back into motion. When I walked into that diner, the bell over the door jangled the same tired note it had for 20 years. The place smelled like grease and coffee. The vinyl booth stuck to your pants in the summer, and the jukebox was probably still full of songs I'd rather not hear. I sat in the corner, hands wrapped around a mug that steamed like it was holding the last of my patience. I watched the door. He came in late, hat in hand, shoulders rounded like he'd been carrying the weight of the world on them. Ethan looked older, smaller somehow, as if the arrogance that once filled the room had been stripped down to raw bone. His hair was longer on the top, the way kids try to act older, and his suit, if you could call it that, hung on him wrong. He'd lost the swagger, the confident gait. He looked like a man who had been reading the obituaries and realized he'd been on the wrong page. When he saw me, his face flushed and went pale in the same breath. He walked over like a man walking into a firing range and sat across from me without a word. For a moment, the two of us just looked at each other, like two strangers in a movie about regret. His voice, when he finally spoke, was small. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I made a mess. I thought I was doing the right thing. We thought we could control it. I don't know what I thought. There's a particular sound that remorse makes when it's real. It's not speechy or theatrical. It's the kind of silence that fills the space between words." He ate at it like a man starving. I didn't reach across the table. I didn't hug him. The man who raised him had been taught to show strength, not with demonstrations but with steadiness. I listened. He told me about late-night meetings, about Daniel's promises, about how the investors had whispered about putting Ethan in charge because a young CEO would be easier to control. He described how numbers looked on paper until they start to look like promises to yourself, the sort that swallow your sense of right. He told me Laura was in the hospital, a collapse, complications from something that had been ignored for too long. The voice on the other end of those words sounded guilty and terrified at the same time.
He had to let me know because he needed help.
Or perhaps, more likely, because a part of him still remembered that the man at the table had once been the one to teach him how to get back up. When he finished, there was a moment where the waitress refilled our coffee, the clatter of silverware clacking on plates. The rest of the diner might as well have been a world away. I took a breath like a man collecting his tools. "No, son," I said quietly. "You didn't make a mistake. You made a choice." He flinched like my words had physical weight. There's a difference in the language of responsibility. A mistake can be salvaged with time and luck. A choice settles into history. He looked like a man who'd watched the road he'd chosen shrink into a tunnel. He started to say something, to argue, to soften it with reasons. He said Daniel had convinced him, promised him control, influence, a chance to show the world he could run something bigger than I'd ever imagined for him. He said it with the apologetic tone of a man who still thought the future might be bought clean with empty words. I could have let him have his absolution. I could have thrown my chest open and let him climb back in. But life had taught me the cost of coddling it out of responsibility. So I sat there and listened instead. The thing about being hurt is that revenge becomes a tempting wind. For a long time I thought revenge would feel great, righteous, warm. But over the months I'd learned something else. The best kind of victory isn't the one that ruins another man. It's the one that saves yourself. "You're broke," I said, because someone needed to say it. "And your mother's in the hospital. People want money. The lawyers are breathing down your neck. What do you expect me to do?" He looked down at his shaking hands. I don't know. I made bad choices. I can't fix everything. His voice broke. I thought of all the nights I'd sat up with him when he was a kid, when fever took him and I rubbed his forehead until the sweat cooled. I thought of teaching him how to hold a hammer right, how to measure twice and cut once. I thought of nights staying late at the office so he could have the college fund. None of that erased what he'd done, but it reminded me who he was and who I was. I hadn't always been the man he needed, but I could be the man he needed now, so I paid his debts. It wasn't a grand gesture. I wired funds to cover the most immediate creditors and had Sam talk through the legal entanglements. I didn't hand him the keys to the kingdom. I didn't restore him to the role Daniel had promised. I paid what would stop him from living in the gutter and what would keep his mother's lights on. Then I helped him find work. Real work, not the grand, slick promises Daniel had wrapped around him. Not at Hale and Pierce's executive floor, but at a smaller regional firm where men earned their bones and didn't buy them with lies. I arranged an introduction, a straight-up job where he'd start on the ground and prove himself the way people used to. It wasn't charity. It was a test framed in dignity. There's a curious thing people don't tell you about forgiveness. Sometimes it's not a soft thing. Sometimes it's the hardest, sharpest choice you can make. Giving a man a way back can be the final act that proves you survived. It says quietly and without fanfare, I am still whole. For me, extending a hand to Ethan wasn't weakness. It was the last clean step in closing a chapter. Let him learn how heavy life is without the safety net of deceit. Let him build his way back with honest effort. We sat in the diner for a long time after. He promised to see Laura, to visit the hospital, to stand with her if she wanted him. He promised to show up to work the way a man with a spine does. I believed him cautiously, like a carpenter tapping a beam to see if it's rotten. When we left, we didn't hug. We shook hands the way two businessmen might before making a deal. Solemn, practical. It felt right in its own way. I didn't want a theater of grief. I wanted something quieter. An agreement between a father and a son to try again under different rules. Driving back to the cabin later, the lake shimmered under a low winter sun, cold and hard as glass. The air smelled of pine and smoke from someone's house down the road. I thought about the long road ahead, the lawsuits that would drag on, the spaces in my life that would never fill the same way, the lessons that would scar us for years. Yet beneath it all, strange as it sounds, there was a sliver of relief. I'd made a choice too, to salvage what could be salvaged, to be the kind of man who doesn't let bitterness consume him. Helping Ethan wasn't absolution for either of us. It was a start, a brick laid in the slow rebuilding of a life that had cracked open. And sometimes that's all anyone can do. Looking back now, after all the years, after the dust has long settled and the echoes of those painful days have softened into something almost bearable, I can finally see the truth with a kind of clarity I didn't have back then. Betrayal, that word that once burned in my chest like a wound that wouldn't heal, doesn't define who you are. It doesn't shape the boundaries of your worth, no matter how deep it cuts. What defines you, what truly marks the line between who you were and who you become, is how you choose to respond when life shatters the trust you built piece by piece, when you're standing in the ruins of everything you believed in, when the people you'd have given your life for turn their backs, when your love becomes someone else's leverage, when your generosity becomes the rope they use to climb out while you sink. You start to see the raw truth of human nature. You start to understand that not everyone is built to hold the weight of loyalty. Some people love convenience, not connection. Some people mistake your silence for weakness and your forgiveness for surrender. And some will look you in the eye, swear they care, and still drive the knife a little deeper because it's easier than facing their own failures. I used to think betrayal was the end of something, the end of love, the end of family, the end of trust. But what I've learned is that betrayal is often the beginning of knowing who you really are without the noise of expectation, the beginning of seeing yourself not as a victim of someone else's decision, but as a survivor of your own resilience. People will break your trust, sometimes in small, almost invisible ways that only sting for a moment, and sometimes in ways so brutal they leave marks you can still feel years later. They will twist your kindness until it feels like a weakness, and they will take your love, your time, your belief in them, and turn it into a weapon without ever realizing how deeply they've cut you. But here's the truth I had to learn the hard way. They can't take your peace unless you hand it over. They can't destroy you unless you let them decide what your worth is. If you're listening to this, if you've ever felt that hollow kind of pain, the one that crawls under your ribs and makes you question whether anything you gave ever mattered, then maybe you'll understand. You know what it's like to sit in a quiet room after everything's fallen apart, to hear the sound of your own breathing, and wonder how it's still steady. You know the ache of replaying every word, every sign you missed, every moment you thought things could still be saved. And if that's you, if you're in that place right now, here's what I'll tell you. Not as advice, but as someone who's lived through it. You cannot control who betrays you. You cannot control the lies they tell, the greed that drives them, or the emptiness that makes them hurt you just to feel something. But you can control who you become after. That's where the real power is. You can choose not to be bitter. You can choose not to become the reflection of their cruelty. You can choose to rebuild brick by brick, even when your hands are shaking and your heart feels hollow. You can choose to learn, to forgive in your own way. Not because they deserve it, but because you deserve peace more than you deserve revenge. That's the hardest part to understand, the one that took me years. Forgiveness isn't a gift you give to them. It's the key that unlocks your own cage. The night I made that call, the one that changed everything, I didn't do it to destroy them. That would have been easy. Destruction is always easy when anger's hot enough to burn everything it touches. But I didn't want to live in ashes anymore. I made that call to save myself, to reclaim the part of me I'd buried under resentment and pride. I wanted to stop being the man defined by what others had taken and start being the man defined by what I still had left. My dignity, my integrity, my peace. That call wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about freedom, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't need to prove anything. It's quiet, calm, steady. It's the kind that lets you wake up one morning, look at your reflection and not see the pain staring back. It's the kind that lets you walk through the places that once haunted you and feel nothing but stillness. Forgiveness didn't erase what happened. It didn't make Ethan's choices disappear, or Laura's lies fade, or Daniel's greed seem smaller. It didn't undo the years of trust that were broken or the sleepless nights that followed. But it did something else, and something more important. It made me free. Freedom doesn't always come with celebration. Sometimes it comes in silence, when you finally stop explaining yourself, stop replaying the betrayal, stop needing answers that will never come. It's the moment you realize that closure isn't something someone gives you, it's something you decide to take. It's waking up and realizing that you don't owe the past any more of your present. When I stood by that lake again months later, the same one where everything had started to fall apart, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: stillness. The water didn't care about what happened. It reflected the sky just the same. That's when it hit me. Life goes on whether you do or not. And I wanted to go on. I realized then that revenge had never been about punishment. It had always been about reclaiming my control, about showing that no matter how deep the betrayal cut, I could rise without letting hate dictate my steps. The truest revenge, I learned, is peace, the kind that can't be bought, can't be stolen, can't be faked. So if you're listening to this, remember, the people who betray you don't win because they hurt you. They win only if you let them turn you into something you're not. Don't let them. Rise above the wreckage. Walk through the fire, not to destroy, but to purify. Because one day, and that day will come, you'll wake up, the pain will be quieter, the memories softer. You'll look around and realize you're still standing, and in that quiet moment you'll understand what I did. That freedom, the kind that doesn't depend on anyone else's apology or validation, that's the sweetest victory of all.